Chenj, so this is where we really dive into history. But as a taking off point, let's start this episode with a kind of footnote to the last one.
So, a footnote to episode 4, where we talked about the positionality of seen on radio.
And we heard about Ad Fontes, the company that rates news sources for their bias and reliability. And I want to pick up on that question you raised about the Ad Fontes model and whether it reinforces the idea that the best journalism is neutral or quote-unquote unbiased journalism.
Right. The CEO, Vanessa Otero, said that's not her or her company's take on bias. She said there's no such thing as unbiased, and those in the middle of the Ad Fontes chart are just in the middle, not better than the sources with higher bias ratings. But we came away thinking that the way the company presents its ratings does end up perpetuating the idea that the best journalism shoots for the middle.
So with that in mind, listen to one media maker who has received Ad Fontes ratings, Michael Smerconish. He's fairly well known. He's been a talking head on CNN over the years, and a guest and a fill-in host at the former MSNBC. He's an attorney and a one-time Republican who moved to the center. These days, Smerconish does a radio show on Sirius XM, the satellite and online radio network, and of course he does a podcast.
Ad Fontes Media is a Denver-based corporation that exists.
Smerconish put out this video in 2024. It's about his Ad Fontes ratings.
Numbers. It's like me getting a report card. So
he seems happy and more than a little proud because Ad Fontes put his shows close to the middle of its chart on that bias scale.
Plus 1.8. Damn close to a Blutarski, a 0.0 to which I strive. I'll take it.
To be fair, Smerconish is saying that he strives to be seen as middle of the road. He doesn't explicitly say that everybody should, but yeah, he's obviously feeling pretty good about it.
Quite proud of his report card.
John, you've mentioned this, that you worked as a public radio reporter and documentary maker for a long time.
Yeah, about 20 years.
In those days, what did you understand about the importance of neutrality or objectivity?
It was never simple. I was never in the Smerconish camp. I really wrestled with how to think about bias, and there was always nuance in it for me. I remember decades ago talking with colleagues in a public radio newsroom and saying that I thought our goal as reporters should be fairness, really, doing justice to people's stories and their positions on issues, not balance in some, what I thought of as dumb, both-sidesy way. But at the same time, in some vague sense, I did imbibe the general idea that real journalism, and yes, traditional old-school journalism, was rooted in a posture of neutrality or objectivity.
Like that's how the OG reporters did it.
Yes, and if you came with the point of view, you were doing something newfangled, something invented by Hunter S. Thompson and the New Journalists or something, like something kind of postmodern-ish. In fact, Chenj, I had a friend, let's just say someone who works in the public broadcasting world. We were having coffee, and this person asked me, essentially, given the kind of work I do now, do I still consider myself a journalist?
Woo. Man, I've heard that a lot. People come to me because, the kind of conclusions that my historical podcasts tend to arrive at, they're like, is this journalism? And I almost feel like when people ask me that, what they're really saying is, for a long time, we've had this tradition of neutral journalism that just sticks to the facts without an agenda. And now you're messing with that. And whenever people say that, I feel like we really need to think about what the best tradition of journalism is.
Which brings us to this episode, where we're going to go back in time.
Because that's another way to approach these questions, to look at the history of the news.
We're going back centuries in this episode. But before we really dive in, Chenj, what about this widespread belief that the greatest tradition of journalism, and American journalism, is the objective, unbiased, aiming down the middle approach that Michael Smerconish embraces?
Or let me ask it this way. Over the last several hundred years, of all the people putting out news and information, and I'm talking about people who moved history with their journalism, how many of those people were claiming to be neutral and above the fray?
For example, take a historical period that lots of Americans cherish. The time of the Revolution, the founding of the U.S. as an independent country, the writing of the Constitution, and let's keep going, into the 19th century and the rise of the United States as a global power. In those days, we're talking newspapers. What were they like?
Most of them took sides. To illustrate the point, most of the mail that the Postal Service delivered in the first decades of U.S. history was newspapers, and virtually all of those newspapers were openly partisan in their politics.
We're going to hear more about that in the episode. But that was the norm pretty much through the 1800s, right?
Absolutely. Think about somebody like Horace Greeley. That's a name a lot of people have heard. He was the founder and publisher of the New York Tribune, one of the most popular daily newspapers in the U.S. before, during, and after the Civil War. In the 1850s, Greeley's paper promoted the views of the new Republican Party, taking a strong stand against slavery.
In fact, before the Civil War, Greeley hired these two guys named Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels as European correspondents for the Tribune. There's a quote that's often attributed to Greeley that journalism will kill you, but it will keep you alive while you're at it, which sounds to me like the kind of thing you'll say if you're doing journalism as a personal and moral mission, not simply a business.
But this was normal in Greeley's time. Most newspapers and most journalists held strong political views and expressed them openly. And of course, the advocacy was not just on the left.
No. Some listeners heard our season 6 on the Wilmington Massacre and Coup of 1898, in which the Democratic Party in North Carolina, which was openly white supremacist at the time, won a rigged statewide election. And then Democrats forced out at gunpoint the racially integrated Republican and populist leadership of the city of Wilmington. Historians call it the only successful coup d'etat in U.S. history. A white mob killed dozens and maybe hundreds of black people in Wilmington on November 10, 1898.
And newspapers were at the center of the whole story. You had the Raleigh News and Observer, one of the state's leading newspapers then and now. Its editor collaborated closely with the leaders of the state Democratic Party. The paper waged a vicious campaign against black voting rights and political participation.
That campaign included a series of editorial cartoons leading up to the 1898 election. This is from that Scene on Radio series.
One showed a huge foot labeled Negro stepping on a small prostrate white man with the caption,
"A serious question. How long will this last?"
After the coup succeeded in 1899, a News and Observer editorial called for permanent good government by the party of the white man.
At the same time, a black-owned newspaper in Wilmington, the Daily Record, was pivotal in the story too. In 1898, the paper published a provocative editorial about lynching and about the real or alleged relationships between black men and white women that were often the pretext for lynchings.
Tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman.
The white supremacy campaign used that article to inflame white men against black people and their rights. And the day of the massacre in Wilmington, the first thing the white mob did was to burn down the Daily Record's office. The vigilantes wanted to lynch Manley, but he'd slipped out of town.
That makes the point, doesn't it? These newspapers were not pretending for a second that they didn't have a dog in the fight. And by the way, look at that. We're back in North Carolina.
We weren't planning to go to the border belt in this episode because we're leaving the present day and heading into the past. But yes, Wilmington is on the Atlantic coast, just southeast of the border belt counties we've been hearing from. And actually, it only took me a few minutes to find stuff from the period we're talking about from the border belt itself. For example, from the Laurinburg Exchange, the newspaper that still serves Scotland County.
That's where Penny Abernathy lives, right?
Yeah, the former newspaper executive and news desert expert from episode 2. Penny and I drove around Scotland County, which is about 100 miles from Wilmington. So just a few months after the Wilmington coup in 1899, the North Carolina State Legislature, the General Assembly, was considering a state constitutional amendment, which it would pass. The amendment required a literacy test, wink wink, for voter registration as a way to disenfranchise black voters. A Laurinburg Exchange editorial in January 1900 said this: "All white men who prefer to see the whites in ascendancy must lay aside petty differences and unite in the solemn purpose to ratify that amendment." The Laurinburg Exchange called itself a Democratic Journal, with a capital D, on its masthead.
That's even more open partisanship than we have now, even with Fox News just straight out working for the Republican Party, or MS Now for the Democrats. So again, journalism that had a point of view was very common, really until the 20th century. And it's important to think about when and why that changed. How do we get this idea that journalism should be neutral or fair and balanced?
To put it another way, what was the real motivation for people in the news business to adopt objectivity as the gold standard of journalism? And what did that change have to do with other changes, such as the shift to news as big business, with advertising as the main source of those profits?
And crucially, why does this history matter to us now, as we think about the role of the media in our time of crisis? If we're trying to understand how we got into the mess we're in, maybe it helps to follow the money.
From the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, this is Scene on Radio, Season 8, The News, Episode 5. I'm John Biewen, and that was my co-host and collaborator, Chenjerai Kumanyika. He's a podcaster and journalism professor at New York University. Chenj will be back later to talk some things through. In this episode, a quick trip through the early history of the news. How did the media come into the world in the first place? And how have powerful people shaped and distorted the structure and content of the news over hundreds of years?
News from Greece! Mark Antony is safe, but most of the ships in his fleet sent in aid of Gaius, Julius, Caesar have been lost at sea. Caesar is now surrounded and severely outnumbered.
This is how the HBO series Rome imagined a herald, or praeco in Latin, of the ancient Roman Empire.
The forces of the Republic and Senate under Pompey Magnus confidently expect a decisive victory to follow shortly.
From ancient times up to a few hundred years ago, emperors and aristocracies, and in some places religious leaders, were the main sources of authority and of news. Well, official news, beyond people just talking with each other. Rulers wanting to communicate with their subjects could send out heralds or town criers. Maybe the more consequential news was the information the ruling classes shared among themselves, delivered, of course, on horseback and on foot.
Elites are going to have networks of correspondence in different places, sort of the early era of diplomacy, of sending your representatives to different cities, and their main job is going to be to send news back. And so that's going to be happening in correspondence. It's going to be, a lot of handwritten news that you're receiving.
Rachael King is an English professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She studies British literature and media in the 18th century and before. King says in medieval Europe, if monarchs and lords wanted to get word to ordinary people, their subjects, they knew where to reach them.
One thing that can be hard for us to imagine is that a lot of news you would actually get in church. So in addition to the religious aspects of going to church every week, there would also be a sort of point where there's news being disseminated as well.
Big change finally arrives with new technology. Johannes Gutenberg prints his first Bible around 1454. Most people can't read, and it takes decades for the epoch-making potential of the printing press to show up. It takes a media-savvy German monk. Martin Luther published his 95 Theses in 1517. Legend has it he nailed it to the door of a Wittenberg church. It sent a radical message to anyone who could read or be read to.
Christians are to be taught that he who gives to the poor or lends to the needy does a better deed than he who buys indulgences.
If the Pope can empty purgatory, why would he not do so out of love rather than for money?
This audio is from the 2003 movie Luther.
My God, who is this Martin Luther?
While sparking the Protestant Reformation, Luther became by far the most popular publisher of his time. He churned out pamphlets like a busy substacker, dozens of them from 1517 to 1520 alone. They were called Flugschriften, flying writings, short essays that Luther wrote in a punchy style, and not in Latin, the language of elites, but in everyday German. It is a grave error for anyone to think that they should aim to make satisfaction for their sins, when in fact God, in his unfathomable grace, always forgives those sins for free. The booklets got him in trouble with the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor.
These books contain heresies against our Holy Church. Do you recant what you've written?
And made him a celebrity who could get a hero's welcome from peasants when he came to their town. Luther and others triggered the era of the pamphleteer, the writer sharing information, true or not, and opinion. Pamphleteers were usually trying to advance a religious or political movement in those turbulent times, and to make money. For those who could afford to buy a copy, scholars have estimated that a pamphlet cost about as much as a hen or a wooden pitchfork. Luther himself refused to accept payment, but his work did make some printers rich. Pascal Verhoest is a Belgian scholar who studied pamphleteering during the 17th century.
And I am a professor of communication at a Free University in Brussels.
Verhoest told me the ideas expressed in pamphlets reached way beyond the small minority of Europeans who could actually read them.
Pamphlets would be read out loud, in porches, in front of churches, on bridges, wherever people would be gathering. And that's why I think that you can actually say that it is the first commercial mass medium.
This happened despite the fact that in several European monarchies at the time, pamphleteering was basically illegal. Some kingdoms tried banning unauthorized printing. When that didn't work, they tried licensing schemes to regulate the trade. But it was just too easy to print pamphlets in secret and distribute them anonymously.
The monarchy actually failed to control the system, and then they discovered, well, the only way we have to respond is to start writing pamphlets ourselves. So we would, there is the propaganda of the opposition, and we will counter that with our own propaganda. So what you get is a very lively scene of opposing views and ideological and religious battles being fought out through these pamphlets.
In one of his scholarly papers, Verhoest quotes an English parliamentarian in 1648 who said, "If our adversaries write all, and we nothing at all, the conquering sword will be conquered by the pen." In other words, if you can't beat them, join them. The rise of pamphleteering was a powerful business opportunity for printers, like those who'd grown rich from Luther's religious writings. In the 17th century, some pamphlets started looking like the news as we know it, with stories about crime, war, natural disasters. Rachael King says these stories weren't just spoken out loud to the illiterate masses.
It's still going to be a lot of oral transmission, but there's going to be people traveling from town to town with printed ballads, but then they'll also sing the ballads as they're disseminating them in print form.
Good Christians all, attend unto my ditty, and you shall hear strange news from London city.
This is a news ballad from 1680, collected and recorded by the English Broadside Ballad Archive at UC Santa Barbara.
Hailstones as big as eggs apace down fell, and some much bigger, as I hear some tell.
It tells the story of a London storm, with hail so big, the ballad claims, that it killed a man.
His child being by at this was terrified. My father, he is dead, the child, he cried.
So far, this musical journalism might sound like straight news, but even this report about a freak natural mishap had an agenda, a religious one in this case. The last section of the ballad offered stern advice.
Who only knows what there is yet to follow, and when the grave each sinful man shall swallow, repent in time and fit yourselves for death. Then do not fear how soon you lose your breath.
Pascal Verhoest says the first news publications in the 16th and 17th centuries freely borrowed stories from one another, without giving credit or confirming the facts.
Not only did they not care about their sources, but they also cared very little about truth. Their first purpose was to sell. Yeah? There was a commercial interest. So what did sell? Well, spectacle, but also libel and vulgarity were good arguments to sell. So what we call objectivity or neutrality was not really a characteristic of the early pamphlets.
The first printed newspapers, as such, appeared in Europe in the 1600s. Typically several sheets of paper, folded, with articles from multiple correspondents. Most concentrated on foreign news, in part because reporting on domestic issues was often restricted. Pascal says early newspapers were not important to most people.
Because the mass medium was pamphleteering, and the newspaper was much more something for elites. So it will take another years before the newspaper became a mass medium, which was really popularized. Right? It happened gradually over the period of a century.
A more modern kind of news media emerged along with the Enlightenment and with the shift toward liberal democracy. In England, 17th century figures like Milton and Locke argued the government should not put tighter limits on the printed word than on the spoken one. The British government allowed a major censorship law, the Licensing Act, to expire in 1695. So increasingly in the 18th century, we got a freer press that reached more people and started to treat its readers as citizens who might actually have a say. Academics talk about this shift as the development of the public sphere, a space between the government on one hand and private interests on the other, where citizens can debate how the society should run. Journalism plays an essential role in the functioning of the public sphere. But as Pascal Verhoest told me, there's always been a chasm between the theory and the reality of this marketplace of ideas.
The idealist model is we have these individuals, they all represent their own interest, they talk with each other in a reasonable way, they reach a consensus, and that then is the general interest.
Right.
The reality, and that's where media history is so interesting to look at, is that, it was not rational. And there were many inequalities between people, and there were many manipulations. So you could say that before even we invented the concept of the public sphere, it was already corrupted power imbalances, and by what we call with a modern term commodification, by commercial interests.
From its earliest days, the news media and the stories it told were shaped and distorted by rich and powerful people who had outsized control of the press, and by the profit motive. How much would any of that change with the birth of the United States, a country founded, at least rhetorically, on principles of self-government and on the central role of a free press? Before Benjamin Franklin got world famous as a scientist, statesman, and founding father, he made his fortune as a printer. When he was just 25 in 1731, Franklin published an essay in his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, titled Apology for Printers. He'd been criticized for printing an ad that took a smart-alecky swipe at the clergy. The ad, selling seats on a voyage to Barbados, said that neither prostitutes nor men of the cloth were welcome on the ship.
And in that piece, he basically says, I'm the printer, it's my newspaper, but I'm just the guy who pulls the press. I'm just the guy who sets the type.
Joseph Adelman is a history professor at Framingham State University in Massachusetts. He specializes in politics and communication in the early U.S. Adelman says Franklin's apology lays some of the groundwork for arguments about a free press that will culminate more than 50 years later in the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Adelman continues, paraphrasing the younger Franklin in his Apology for Printers.
My job is to provide a forum for opinions in the town and to let people debate things out. If you're mad at something that's printed in the newspaper, be mad at the person who wrote it, who might be anonymous, but be mad at the person who wrote it. Don't be mad at me.
If all printers were determined not to print anything till they were sure it would offend nobody, there would be very little printed. American colonists like Franklin were building on free speech ideas that had already been fought over in Britain, Joseph says, including, crucially, that the government should not censor opinions expressed in print. By 1765, 24 weekly newspapers are operating in the 13 colonies. The conflict between American colonists and the British government is heating up. Adelman says the tone and the content of colonial newspapers changes.
Well, it might be a little too obvious to say that it gets more political, but it does get more political.
Many papers choose a side.
One of the things that the revolutionary crisis in the 1760s and 1770s does is, especially in places where there are multiple newspapers, really pushes people to just lean hard into a partisan take for the patriots, sometimes a little less frequently for the loyalists, but it really pushes people to make a decision and say, no, what I'm doing is projecting this particular view. They're portraying it as freedom of the press, but in a new-ish way of thinking about the press as an oppositional check on government power.
Adelman says a network of newspapers played a key role in advancing the Patriots' cause, given the size of what would soon become the United States.
It's a very long way from Boston to Savannah when you're riding by horse and ferrying across rivers. And so to have newspapers able to reproduce and reprint and magnify news and conversations was critical to the way in which American revolutionaries went about their protests against British policy and then prosecuting a war against Great Britain.
Joseph tells the story of an important news delivery made by a man who's better known for a different ride.
So, Paul Revere.
About a year and a half before his famous midnight ride to Lexington to shout that the British were coming, the silversmith, Revere, was already active among groups in Boston. agitating against British policies like changes in the tea tax.
The Boston Tea Party happens on December 16th, 1773. And all of the lead up, the tea gets dumped into the harbor. Pretty much immediately, Paul Revere, who served as a messenger for a lot of Patriot Sons of Liberty causes, gets on his horse and heads south and west towards New York with an account of, this is what we just did. I feel bad for the horse.
Revere carries with him to New York a copy of the Massachusetts Spy, a Sons of Liberty newspaper published just before the Tea Party went down. Another messenger took that paper and a statement from the Committee of Patriots in New York endorsing the action in Boston and rode on to a newspaper publisher in Philadelphia. Adelman says the riders went from Boston to Philadelphia in just 8 days, about half the normal time for that journey.
William Bradford, the printer of the Pennsylvania Journal, prints a special that he labels as a Christmas box for his customers.
Christmas box for the customers of the Pennsylvania Journal.
It's a one-page, single-sided sheet that's printed up very quickly.
Philadelphia, December 24. At 2 o'clock this afternoon arrived in this city a gentleman who came express from New York with the following advices from Boston. The special issue printed the text of the Boston newspaper article and of the letter the messenger brought from New York. But as Adelman explains, the biggest chunk of the page consisted of something else, a vivid account of what happened in Boston Harbor just before Paul Revere jumped on his horse.
It's one of the most interesting things I found in my research, because that particular account I have not been able to locate in newspapers or anywhere else.
They repaired to Griffin's Wharf, where the tea vessels lay, proceeded to fix tackles, and hoisted the tea upon deck, cut the chests to pieces, and threw over the side.
That account that's published on December 24th, I'm pretty sure is Paul Revere going, you guys are not going to believe what just happened. Let me tell you about this.
It is to be observed that they were very careful that not any of the tea should be stolen, so kept a good lookout, and detected one man filling his pockets, whom they treated very roughly by tearing his coat off his back and driving him up the wharf through thousands of people who cuffed and kicked him as he passed. The fact that the messengers got the news to Philadelphia and into the newspaper so quickly might have made a real difference. Before the Boston Tea Party, patriots in Philadelphia had warned another British captain not to deliver his shipload of tea to their city. On Christmas, the day after the Pennsylvania Journal pushed out its special edition, that ship, the Polly, sailed up the Delaware River toward Philadelphia. The captain was told what had happened in Boston and shown a pamphlet signed by the Committee for Tarring and Feathering. He turned his ship around, still loaded with tea, and sailed back to Britain. If a robust and outspoken press helped the revolution succeed, that would help explain why at least some of America's founders were passionate about the importance of the news. Thomas Jefferson famously wrote this in a letter in 1787, months before the Constitutional Convention. The basis of our governments being the opinion of the people, the very first object should be to keep that right. And were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. But Jefferson didn't stop there. People who share that quote often don't include his very next line. But I should mean that every man should receive those papers and be capable of reading them. Jefferson wanted everyone to receive a newspaper. That could imply that the press should be free in more than one sense of that word. That the government should not only leave journalists free to print what they want to print, but it should do something more.
You know, when we're talking about the early framers and founders, there's no need here to unduly romanticize them. They're very flawed individuals.
Victor Pickard is a professor of media policy and political economy at the University of Pennsylvania. Yes, Jefferson and many other founders were slaveholders, And, Victor says, their notions of self-government and citizenship excluded Black and Indigenous people and women.
They were often talking about propertied white males at this time. But nonetheless, I think it's very important, or at least it's instructive, to see how they were thinking about the key relationships between government and the press and democracy. And it was clear, based on all their writings at the time, that they truly believed that democracy was impossible without a free press, and a press that people could actually access.
To help citizens access the news, people like Jefferson, Washington, and Madison supported the creation of a strong postal service. The new Congress passed the Postal Service Act in 1792.
And it's very important that we realize, when we're talking about the postal system in the 1800s, we're talking about what was essentially a newspaper delivery infrastructure. So in the late 1700s, as much as 70% or more of the weight of the post was made up of newspapers. It wasn't just writing letters home to mom. It was really this delivery of news and information to far-flung communities across the land.
When the first Congress set postal rates, it chose to subsidize the mailing of newspapers by charging more for letters and other mail. A lot more.
And the range of debate was basically entirely socialistic, which was all newspapers should circulate for free, that there should be free postage for all newspapers throughout the post, or that it should just be heavily subsidized. And in the end, the more conservative policymakers won out, so that it was just heavily subsidized, but to the tune of what in today's currency would equal tens of billions of dollars.
Under that first Postal Service law, it cost between 6 and 25 cents to mail a letter, depending on the distance, and only a penny or a penny and a half to mail a newspaper.
You know, this idea that media subsidies is somehow antithetical to core American freedoms. I mean, media subsidies are as American as apple pie.
The emphasis that those early leaders put on supporting and sustaining a free press seems to have paid off. The number of newspapers in the U.S. grew almost tenfold between the end of the Revolutionary War and 1820 to more than 600 papers. Research has found that by 1830, 90% of the U.S. mail, by weight, was made up of newspapers. Most papers existed in large part to advance a political party, and though newspaper publishing was a for-profit business in early America, it was a modest trade, not a way to get rich. Victor says advertising was not the lifeblood of the press as much as it would be a century later or in our time. Besides that cheap postage that effectively subsidized their business, a lot of newspaper publishers in the early 19th century earned money from the government in other ways, by printing government documents or putting paid official notices in the paper.
So there were various ways the government was subsidizing the press. The press was also being subsidized by, whichever party it aligned with. It was receiving support from individual readers. Subscriptions, we'd call them today. And it was receiving some advertising revenue. But based on the data that we can gather at this point, it's very clear that advertising really only made up a relatively small percentage. It was different from paper to paper. It was certainly less than 40% of their overall funding, at least up until after the Civil War. We think in some cases it may have been as low as 10 to 20%. But it certainly was not a major part of their business model.
That changes, Pickard says, starting in about the 1880s.
Really when, as we're slowly getting up to what we think of as the Gilded Age, what certain publishers discovered was that newspaper publishing could be a really profitable business, and primarily through advertising.
The Gilded Age was a time, of course, when the industrial ownership class asserted its dominance and flaunted its wealth, and inequality deepened in the U.S. By the early 1900s, Victor says, the typical paper was earning 70% of its revenue through ads.
What this means is that the whole nature of the relationship, whereas before publishers saw their readers as members of a democratic polity, increasingly they began to see their readers as primarily consumers, as almost the product that they needed to capture. They needed to capture our attention, and they needed to deliver it to advertisers. And to do so, this changes the nature of content. This is when we start seeing much more sensationalistic content, and getting into the early 1900s, you start hearing more and more about yellow journalism, which is kind of the clickbait of today. They're really trying to bait people's attention.
Chenj, what's on your mind?
Well, we can see here that there's two things that are true. One is these continuities, right? The ways that news from hundreds of years ago feels familiar to us. And at the same time, how things have changed in important ways. But I think a key lesson is that there was nothing inevitable about the media system we're living with now, right? It totally could have been different, and it still can be different.
Wait, do you mean to suggest that we could, in principle, choose that the media ecosystem is not actually an ecosystem, not an organism shaped by nature? It's man-made, shaped by policies and laws and other choices, and it could be redesigned? What kind of crazy talk is this, that we could make something that works better?
Yes, I know, it's radical, woke, utopian talk. But let's go back. A couple of things I noticed. First, in your research and interviews about the early modern era in Europe, we see that pamphleteering in the earliest newspapers emerged in societies that were led by aristocracies. So the news was heavily shaped and distorted by deep inequalities of wealth and power, by censorship and regulation, and by the profit motive.
So you get pamphleteering as the first commercial mass medium, as Pascal Verhoest calls it. And you find publishing that changes history, like Luther's writings that launched the Protestant Reformation. And you get sensationalism, made-up stories, stuff designed to provoke and to sell above all. Sounds familiar.
Then we get to America. In colonial times leading up to the Revolution, you had this activist press, at least on the side of the revolutionaries, a part of the press that's openly advocating for pushback against the British government and ultimately for revolution and independence.
With all the caveats, of course, about what that meant. See Seen on Radio Season 4.
Definitely. Look, the Patriot newspapers opposed the British government, but were mostly fine with the brutality of a slavery-based settler colonial society, fine with the genocide, white supremacy, and patriarchy that were baked into the whole project. But with all that said, let's just sit for a minute with the fact that a lot of newspapers openly took a side during the American Revolution. The papers on the Patriot side were opposing what they would have called the tyranny of the British monarchy. Joseph Adelman said they viewed themselves as providing an oppositional check on government power.
I think I see where you're going with this.
John, I'm just saying, we're talking about the American Revolution. Can you imagine them saying, we better not offend our readers who are loyal to the British Crown or our advertisers. Look, I know Americans are getting locked up in deathly sugar prisons, but no matter what, we as professional journalists must maintain the highest degree of independence and neutrality at all times. In fact, our posture of independence is more important than the outcome of this struggle.
Our journalistic independence is more important than our national independence.
So let's sort of soft pedal what the British Parliament is doing to its colonial subjects and give King George the benefit of the doubt so no one can accuse us of taking a side. Look, I don't know what tradition some of these neutral journalists think they're functioning in, but just to be clear, that's what those pro-independence newspapers did not do.
Right. And sometimes we do callbacks to previous episodes. Here's a call ahead. In episode 7 of this season, we're going to go straight at the question of how the U.S. media have performed in our time, in the face of a systematic assault on American democracy from within. But let's pick up on another thing from this episode. What we heard about the first leaders of the U.S. after the Revolution and their ideas about the press as an essential public good. Well, at least for the fraction of people who they deemed to be full citizens, white men who owned property.
And this point Victor Pickard is making is important, that it wasn't just about the freedom of the press in the First Amendment sense.
Yeah, the Congress shall make no law abridging that freedom and so on.
Right. But people like Jefferson and Madison thought the country should provide an infrastructure to support the dissemination of the news, to help make sure it would actually reach people. That kind of jumps out at us now because it shows they actually had a certain understanding of news and information and its place in what was going to be a Republican form of government. The press wasn't just another industry among, all bunch of companies or something, right? Or primarily a way for people to make money. It was something different.
They saw the press as a necessary public good that needed to be supported and protected as a matter of public policy. More like, drinking water or a system of roads and bridges. We've just lost that as a clear priority.
John, I just want to check. So are you saying that podcasts are as essential as drinking water? Is that?
Well, some are, but...
Now, when you say lost it, right? I mean, is this like something we lost, just like, my keys? Like, where is it? Is it under the table? Or,
right.
Or is the idea that journalism is a public good and needs support, right? Is that something that actually people with wealth and power just took steps to crush and defeat it?
Fair question. And if so, who was that? Who did it? Those are key questions for the next episode. Chenj, you talked about themes that have been consistent over time in the history of the news and things that have changed. Based on the history we've covered in this episode, it seems like we can talk about important shifts in the motivations for doing journalism, at least at the ownership level. And related to that, shifts in the economics of the business.
Again, we don't want to romanticize anything. There's no ideal golden age back there somewhere. But for a long, long time, most journalism had a political mission. Whether you're talking about the pro-patriot Pennsylvania Journal in the 1770s, or the newspapers fighting for the abolition of slavery, or something like the Workingman's Advocate, published in Chicago in the 1860s and 70s.
If you think about the best things that have happened in U.S. history, the biggest moves toward a more just and fair society, good journalism has played a part. There's no question about that. And we're usually talking about the sort of journalism that would now be condescendingly called advocacy journalism.
And to put an even finer point on it, as somebody who teaches journalists, if you're a journalist, you should always try to report what's true, figure out what's true, and report the facts. But if someone invites you to be neutral, they are not inviting you into the best tradition of journalism.
In this episode, we got as far as the 19th century, and we started to hear how things would change.
And it's not a spoiler to say things would get worse, as news became big business, a way for a few people to get rich. But the fight for a better news media didn't end.
So next time.
The U.S. was a global outlier. Again, it's one of these critical junctures where we could have gone down one path and we chose another one, and arguably the wrong one.
In the middle of the 20th century, the struggle would intensify over efforts to build a more independent and democratic news media. The News was created and produced by me, John Biewen, with Chenjerai Kumanyika and story editor Diane Hodson. Assistant producer Arlene Arevalo. Fact-checking by Anna Pujol Mazzini. Production help this time from Jen Kinney. Music by Brian Blade and the Fellowship Band, Michelle Osis, Lily Hayden, Alex Weston, James Nathan Jones, Goodnight Lucas, and Jason Hill. Music consulting by Joe Augustine of Narrative Music. You can find transcripts at our website, scenonradio.org. The show is distributed by PRX. Scenon Radio comes to you from the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University.